Well, I want to welcome our guest today to our webinar. This is the first in a three-part series that we're going to be doing on Native American children's issues. The title of this one is How Did We Get Here? Understanding Tribe Sovereignty and How It Impacts Services for Indigenous Children. My name is Linda Smith. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the Early Childhood Initiative at the Bipartisan Policy Center here in Washington, D.C. BPC is a Washington, D.C. based think tank that works to take the best ideas from both sides of the aisle to promote better policies that address the needs of our nation's most pressing children. And I can honestly say that there's not a need more pressing than some of the problems that we're having right now with children, with childcare, and sort of with the whole mental health issue going on because of COVID. So with that in mind, we're going to be addressing a certain population, and that is the needs of Native American children living both on and off tribal lands, and with a particular focus on what's going on with children who are not on tribal lands and are not getting the services that they may need. So to begin this session, before we get started with our two panelists, we've asked Mary Lyon, an Ojibwe elder and great-grandmother, to give us an opening blessing. So we're going to turn it over to Mary.
Hello, all my relatives. My name is Nijnibi Ikwa Indisnakaz. I'm second water woman. I am from the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. I'm one of the elders in the wisdom keepers, and I don't know, they go global knowledges and the stuff from the elder circle from around the world. I am from the Crane clan, from my mother's line of women, whom is from Leech Lake, Band of Ojibwe and Anishinaabe. And her father was John Jacob White of Sugar Point in Onegum area, who he was a little boy in the last Indian Wars up there. And I find it to be fascinating. So the stories just keep coming when I do these opening prayers, because we speak about who we are and where we came from. My father is Charlie Lyons, from Bena, and he was First Nations Ojibwe, and his mother was a clan mother from the Turtle clan, as her mothers were regular clans from my mother. And my father was born in the late 1800s, and his grandmother was born in the late 1700s. So I just want to put that out there of how our culture needs to stay alive. So I'm going to begin with telling a little bit who we are before we go into the prayer. We were always taught to bring forth our foundation before asking Gitchumani-Du, our creator, for guidance. Our creator we call Gitchumani-Du gave the honorable spirits known as the seven grandfathers, also known as the seven grandmothers, or the seven sacred teachings, gave them responsibility that would be to watch over us Anishinaabe people. These grandfathers sent a messenger down to earth to find somebody to communicate Anishinaabe values. After searching all directions, north, south, east, and west, this messenger found a baby, a little Abanoji. The seven grandfathers instructed the messenger to take the baby around the earth for 7 years to learn the Anishinaabe way of life. After they returned, the grandfathers gave the baby, now a young boy, 7 teachings to share with the Anishinaabe people. Gitchumani-Du, our creator, painted visuals throughout the lands for us to always be reminded of these teachings. When Gitchumani-Du created the eagle that would soar throughout the lands, we would be reminded to hold love within each of us and shower the world with it unconditionally. Then he created the bear to show the bravery. Then came the wolf to show humility, followed with the raven to show honesty. Then he created the turtle to show truth, which led in the buffalo to show the respect. Then he created the beaver to show the wisdom. Opening prayers, I like to smudge and circle in that there, so I'm just gonna light up a little bit of sage, and I offered my same a little early this morning, so it's really important that we cleanse this area here. Thank you, Creator. We wash our hands in the sweet smoke so that we may become constructive and reach out to others in a good way. By continuing this practice, we bring forward the courage our ancestors left us. We bring the smokes over our head and down our backs to lessen our troubles and bring clarity to our daily purpose. This is the honesty our ancestors entrusted in us. We smudge our eyes so we can see good things in all people and learn from them equally as well. For this, we bring respect forward in a good way. We smudge our mouths so that we may speak good things to all people. May we continue to choose our words carefully, for this is the truth we were to abide by. We smudge our ears so that we will listen carefully to all people, learn from what they say, and become someone they will want to talk to. As this is the passage from the beginning to now and will lead into the future, as this is the wisdom that should never be lost. We bring the smoke towards each of us to surround our hearts so that what has been damaged will heal. We promise to grow in a good way and to be strong as we carry our unconditional love forward. We wash our feet in the smoke so that we may walk a pathway full of purpose, compassion, balance, and kindness as we carry what was taught to us through time and stand strong with humility. Creator, Kichimani-du, let the smoke watch over each of us. Collect all our messages of gratitude and gather our worries. Please let them rise up to the sky world. Please let our ancestors see that each of us on the moment-to-moment basis, we will act with good intentions. Let each of us be sacred for the waters that nourish us, the fires that keep us warm, the air that fills our blanket of a body with goodness, as we promise to keep our homelands of Mother Earth healthy. Miigwech, 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 Kichimani-du. May this day begin in a good way with good intentions while we hold the space. Chi miigwech.
I want to thank Mary so much for that blessing, and there's so much wisdom in there. I should note that Mary is the author of a book on wisdom lessons for those who are interested, but so much for us to learn and so much beauty in what she had to say. I want to move forward now and introduce our two panelists who are going to be with us this afternoon. First, Senator Byron Dorgan, who was the U.S. Senator from North Dakota for a number of years. And I promise that I'm not going to read bios. I don't like to do that. So we are putting links in the chat to the bios. But it's important for Senator Dorgan that the audience understands he was in the Senate from 92 to 2011, where he was chairman of the Indian Affairs Committee in the Senate. In addition to that, he is a New York Times bestselling author, and this is the first time I've really had to talk to somebody that was a New York Times bestselling author. That's quite an achievement. And his book today, The Girl in the Photograph, The True Story of a Native American Child Lost and Found in America, we're going to be talking about that a little bit. He is also currently a senior fellow here with the Bipartisan Policy Center. And our other guest is Dr. Anton Treuer, Treuer. I'm sorry, Anton, I trip over that. He's a professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University in Minnesota. He was a graduate of Princeton and the University of Minnesota. He's also an author on books on equity, education, and culture. And today we're going to talk to Anton a little bit about his book, Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask. So I want to welcome both of you, and hopefully we'll just we'll start with a couple of questions, but hopefully we'll just have a conversation about some of these things. I want to start with you, Senator Dorgan, and ask you, you're from North Dakota, and there are a number of Native American tribes in North Dakota, but what got you really interested in the Native American issues that you pursued that in the Senate? And can you describe a little bit about sort of what brought you to this time?
Sure. Well, Linda, first of all, thanks for your work at the BPC, and I'm happy to be here with Dr. Treuer. So let me tell you a little about the background. My father lost both of his parents at a very, very early age. And one of the jobs he had as a very young boy was on the Indian reservation up in the northern part of North Dakota, the 3 affiliated tribes. And he was a young boy that went up and herded horses on the Indian reservation. And that was a job he had. It's a job he found. Two things happened to him. He fell in love with horses, of course. But second, he also became enamored and really interested in Native Americans and their culture and so on. And then later, when my father was an adult and I was a young boy, he drove me to the Indian reservation, the 3 affiliated tribes, and wanted me to introduce me to his friends, wanted me to understand the culture, wanted me to understand what Native Americans had been through, what their challenges were. And so my father taught me about those things. And when I became someone in public service, I was very interested in trying to determine how could I be helpful? How could I reach out with respect to Native Americans? And so that's part of my background. And so I did that, of course. And I'm not a Native American. I have a Native American name given me by the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. And the name is Shante Unwiaka, which means thinks with his heart. And I think with all my heart that if we do the things we can do, finally at long last, we can overcome the great shame that has existed on a couple of very significant issues, slavery and the treatment of Native Americans in America. So that's the background, Linda, of why I have done what I've done. And then I have more recently, of course, written a very specific book about Native Americans. And the book is called The Girl in the Photograph.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I want to encourage, number one, our audience to read the book. It's extremely, I don't know, it's just very moving in terms of this young girl lost in our system in this country. What a shame. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I'm going to try to make it so brief. There was a young woman, I should say young girl, very young girl, age 2, who was beaten very severely on an Indian reservation at a foster home, beaten very severely. She was finally discovered and taken to a hospital. I went down immediately when I saw this news story about it. I met with her later on and her grandfather. I kept in touch with them, and I did a lot of things to try to make sure that people weren't put in these foster homes that were dangerous, and got some money down there that had some caseworkers and so on. But so I kept in touch with this young girl by sending a few little Christmas gifts, birthday gifts to her grandfather's address. Then her grandfather died and she disappeared. And I asked people for years, did anybody know what might have happened to this young girl? Nobody. Never heard of her. No one had heard of her. And 27 years later, I received an email, and it was from that young girl. She was homeless in Minneapolis. And let me tell you what she did. She had PTSD in a very serious way. She has tried to take her life. She was homeless, living on the streets of Minneapolis under a bridge. And she wanted to know what had happened to her. She didn't have a memory of what had happened, the things that had been terrible in her life. And so she went to a library to borrow a computer, and she began doing a search of her name. And when she did a search, she discovered in that search a speech I had given on the floor of the United States Senate about her, using her name and what had happened to her. And I gave that speech in the context of violence against Native American children. And she found it. 27 years later, she sent me an email. I went to Minneapolis very quickly. I became, engaged with trying to be helpful in every possible way that I could. And things are better for her. And she said that she was happy for me to be able to write her story. I asked her if I could do that. She said, if it'll help other Native American children, I'm happy that you would do it. And so any proceeds from this book go to her. I always have. And so just wanted you to know that background. And she's a remarkable, strong woman that's been through the most significant things you can imagine, and she survived.
Wow. You made a statement somewhere along the line in the book about her making herself invisible. And I think that is one of the things that we hopefully can talk about a little bit. But let me move on to Dr. Treuer and talk a little bit about your background. And I was immediately intrigued when somebody referred me to your book. Because the name of his book is Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians, but Were Afraid to Ask. And I think this is a real issue that people are afraid to ask. So I bought the book and I have read it now a couple of times, and there's so much in there. I encourage our audience to read it. But can you talk specifically in your book about sovereignty and self-determination? And I think that tied up in a lot of what prevents people from talking about and working with the tribes is that they don't understand what sovereignty means and what is self-determination. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know that's a big topic, I know.
Oh yeah, I appreciate the question and the opportunity to be in this conversation. Appreciate you, Senator Dorgan, all your work. And I think this is a really trying time in our country. We are, the rates of interracial marriage are higher than they've ever been, but somehow we are more segregated than we were before desegregation. And most Americans have a racially homogenous favorites list on their cell phone. And we're often in political echo chambers. And I think when we don't understand something, or when we don't understand someone, well, it's a lot easier to be ambivalent about its destruction. And we'd all do really well to take all of the folks we want to give a good talking to, whether that's about our health policy or racial climate or whatever the topics happen to be, to take all those folks and give them a good listening to. And I think that the Native experience in particular is one that has been perhaps often imagined in America, but infrequently well understood. And sovereignty, as you mentioned in your question, is one of those important pieces that is often misunderstood. So, there's a whole, college class on Indigenous topics and sovereignty, and I'll try to pull up a couple of the most relevant pieces for today's conversation. So one is the Native population is different from all of the other, racially marginalized groups in that Native people didn't come here. They were always here, had sovereign governments, managed their own affairs, and everything else, including the British Empire, the French Empire, the birth of the American nation, were all things that were built on top of and by supplanting Native people and trying to depose them from governing their own lands and people. And there was a colonial enterprise that was engineered to do that. In spite of all of that, in a country like America, tribes are mentioned in very specific places in the US Constitution. So there's a legal meaning behind that. In the US Constitution, the treaty clause says treaties are the supreme law of the land. In the trade and intercourse clause, where it says only Congress shall regulate trade and manage affairs between the several states and various Indian tribes, what it means is that because tribes do have not just distinct groupings, but distinct governments, that there's a nation-to-nation relationship between them. So in a state like Minnesota, for example, there's a state law that says no gaming and gambling, but those laws don't apply directly to tribes and tribal people. They are governed by their own legal systems and have a direct relationship with the federal government. This ends up being important later on when you look at things like sexual violence, child welfare, and so forth. Most of the laws that impact most of our everyday lives are state laws. The federal government didn't say you can't kill people, but every state government said you can't kill people. That's why in some states there's a death penalty, some there isn't. Each state has their own legal apparatus. One of the things we see, for example, with crimes of sexual violence, most crime in America is white on white, black on black, and so forth. But crimes of sexual violence against Native women are predominantly perpetrated by white men. However, through the evolution of America's legal code, while tribes have retained sovereignty, that sovereignty really only has an effect on their own tribal citizenry. So because most crimes of sexual violence are being perpetrated by white men, and the tribe doesn't have jurisdiction over non-tribal members, then we have had issues with people kind of preying with impunity on Native women, and that impacts trafficking, child welfare and well-being, all kinds of things. So there is an effort to deal with this, and Senator Dorgan's been part of that legislative work in the Violence Against Women Act that would help address some of these jurisdictional issues so that we can protect all Americans wherever they are. And there are many, many complications. So, today, half of the tribal population lives off reservation, only half lives on reservation. The Native experience is complex and varied, and the issues of tribal sovereignty are quite significant. You mentioned, like, even in the beginning of the talk, the woman who is the subject of Senator Dorgan's book, living in Minneapolis as a homeless woman, a huge percentage of the homeless population in the Twin Cities is Indigenous. And most of the really large-scale community interventions have been orchestrated by tribes and tribal governments. Red Lake, for example, just opened a new homeless shelter in the Twin Cities, and things like that. So I think it's important that we communicate with one another. We seek to more deeply understand one another. And there are legal, social, and cultural issues that have a lot of impact on all of these things, so we can help everybody.
I think both of you in your books and in conversation have acknowledged that we have some dark chapters in our history. And I think that, from where I have looked at this issue, it's important to Native people that we acknowledge that. And I think that's one of the things that we wanted to do before we get into moving forward on this topic, is acknowledging some of that. And I'd be curious as to, Anton, why you think that is so important to Native people that we do that, and then how do we move forward without letting that get in the way of us making progress in the future? And I guess I'd be interested first in your comment, and then Senator Dorgan, your thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a tendency when people are confronted with issues of historical injustice to think, why do we have to talk about this? Can't we just go forward or something like that? But if you look at any injustice, even just between two individuals, like a dude who goes out and cheats on his wife, right? Are you going to be able to reconcile that relationship if the guy says, forget about it, it all happened in the past? Mm-hmm. Probably not. The guy's got to say sorry and mean it and be believed, and it'll never happen again, and mean it and be believed. And then you've got whatever percent chance of reconciling that relationship. And, if you have damage that was done, no shrink is going to start the conversation with, don't tell me about your mom. Don't tell me anything that's ever happened to you before. You're only going forward from here. We don't get blank canvases. We have all of our history, and it's an act of emotional maturity to own those dark chapters, shine some light on it. The shame starts to evaporate when we can shine light on it, when we can own, as a nation, slavery, genocide, all these things that have happened. It doesn't diminish our greatness as a nation. It enhances our greatness as a nation to own those things. And when someone is the aggrieved party, like the woman who got cheated on by her husband, then she needs to hear ownership of it to be in the reconciliation, to even consider that. And I think Native people are ready to reconcile, but the don't talk about it, it all happened in the past perspective does great damage to the reconciling and to the cooperative work So as a great nation, then we should own those things and we should seek to remedy them.
That's well said. Senator Dorgan, your thoughts on this?
Well, Linda, the best example I know is Joseph Marshall, a Lakota lecturer who was lecturing some long while ago at the University of Colorado in Boulder, Colorado. And he was describing what has happened to Native Americans, the history and the shame and you know, what had been done and so on. And someone in the audience jumped up and you know, was shouting and waving his arms and saying, wait a second, just give me a moment here. You're talking about your ancestors and my ancestors. So why am I responsible?
Mhm.
And Joseph Marshall simply said, because you know the story. And when you know the story of an injustice, you have a responsibility to deal with it. And it comes back to what Dr. Treuer described. Listen, the book I wrote, the work I have done with respect to Native Americans, I want to make sure we shine all the spotlights on this spot, the spot that describes the history of how we've gotten to this point and what we must do next. It's so interesting to me, and Dr. Treuer, I'm sure, knows this, but we're now seeing all this debate in schools about, for God's sake, don't have anything in our history books that would make people feel uncomfortable about what has happened. Unbelievable to me what's going on.
Mhm.
You know, we need to know the full history of what has happened with respect to Native Americans. They were here first.
Yeah.
And the fact is, if you are not a Native American, you came from somewhere else. That's just a fact.
Yeah. I love the way, Anton, you described that, you know, and you've done it before, and it just is now etched in my brain. I think now, though, we do need to move forward, and there's no question about that. And I think from where the work that we're doing at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we believe that the future really does depend on how we treat our children. And to your point, Senator, on what we're teaching our children, how we're treating our children. And you referred to the fact that about 50-50 Native American are on tribal lands and off. And I think what we're trying to think through here is when we have children who are not within, you know, working and getting services from their tribal governments, where are they? And I am very concerned about something I think both of you have kind of alluded to. They're invisible in a lot of our cities and towns around this country. And so I think what we're trying to do is shine a light on how do we change that dynamic? How do we get states and communities to recognize and try to work with meeting the needs of our children when they are not served by their local or their native governments? So I think what we're trying to get at in this is what in your minds would help foster better relations between tribes and state and local governments. And I think both of you have talked a little bit about it in your books, but I'd be curious as to what advice you would give to our audience on where do we start? How do we change this?
And let me just begin, and maybe Dr. Treuer wants to answer that too, but let me just begin by saying, here's why I decided to start with children. As I left the United States Senate, I was chairman of the Indian Affairs Committee and had worked a lot on Native American issues. And I was trying to think through, I want to continue this work. So how do I do that? How do you focus? And I decided to focus on children. The children are the future. And, you know, and so that's the purpose of my focus. It's the purpose of this book. And I think there are so many things that need to be done. First, by the United States Congress, which shortchanges Native Americans on virtually everything when you deal with healthcare, housing, education, and so on. And then second, the responsibilities of state governments. You mentioned this issue of invisibility. Tamara, the young woman I wrote about, was invisible on the streets of Minneapolis and Rapid City and elsewhere. And the invisibility, we have to get past that by speaking about and writing about and making certain people are uncomfortable to decide they're going to do nothing. That's got to make them uncomfortable. And you know, every American should understand when you start with children, children deserve our help, our assistance. They deserve our investment, and they deserve the opportunities to go to a good school, to have access to decent health care, and to live in a decent shelter. But I'll tell you what, in every circumstance you will find with respect to Native American children generally, they fall far behind that. They're in second place in most cases, and we need to fix it.
Dr. Treuer, how about you?
Oh, I certainly agree with everything that Senator Dorgan just shared. And I don't think that there's a simple silver bullet kind of solution on the policy front, but we have to do much better at educating. And frankly, I think what we are running into is a lot of fear within the general population, and it's reflected in a lot of our leaders. And it's focused around a just us attitude. There's this fear that it's a zero-sum game out there, that if, for example, if people of color, Native Americans in this case, do better, somehow it's going to take something away from white folk. That we're going to end up flipping roles as our demography has changed. The majority of the students in America now are K-12, are students of color. Some people are terrified that we're going to somehow flip roles between who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed, and are fighting against the ascension of marginalized groups out of poverty or, into more fully humanized space. And I think, frankly, we could take all that energy, and instead of fighting over who gets to be the oppressor and who has to be the oppressed, we could fight oppression. Because frankly, we are all dehumanized by any American's poverty. We are all dehumanized that there is a racial predictability to longevity. And that's a fact. And we are all dehumanized by the fact that, in my state of Minnesota, Natives are 2% of the population, but 20% of the state's homeless population. We're considered statistically insignificant when you're doing a data set in education. And what could be more significant when you're looking at, 17% of the state's prison population or 20% of the state's homeless population. So we have to have a more holistic and inclusive, cooperative and constructive conversation about what solutions would look like. And I don't think the fear is well founded. We can shift from just us to justice and have very different results. Be sure, I'm coming for everything my ancestors were denied, but that shouldn't scare anybody, because by that, I mean, I'm coming for longevity. I'm coming for humanity, and that's not going to reduce someone else's longevity or humanity or anything else. We're all going to do better if we all do better.
Linda, let me ask Dr. Treuer a question, if I might, because I referred to this just briefly. There is this discussion across the country about knowledge. What is it that American children should know about what has been happening, what has happened, and therefore what should happen? And the discussion about making children or making anybody uncomfortable by the teaching that goes on with respect to what has gone on in the last couple of hundred years. There's this attempt to try to shut that down. I personally want the American people to have great discomfort about the previous couple of hundred years with respect to Native Americans, because that discomfort is what requires us to decide we have to do something about it. And so, Dr. Treuer, when you're listening to a lot of this, you come from education. What's your sense of that and the difficulty that will pose for those of us that want to shine the light on all of these issues in terms of what has happened and what must happen next?
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. First of all, if you want to get stronger as an individual, well, you go to the gym and you work out, and that does not feel comfortable. But you go again, and it actually starts feeling a little bit better. And you can even acclimate to that, and it starts to feel good going to the gym. growth is good. And as a nation, we need to grow and we need to heal. And some measure of discomfort will be a requirement in order to make that happen. And furthermore, I realize that Americans have very different experiences. And right now, some Americans don't get to live as long as other Americans. And there's a racial predictability to that. Some Americans don't have the same experiences, whether it's going to school, dealing with police, dealing with our healthcare systems. And we should really not have any racial predictability to that, but we do. So if someone is comfortable with a racial predictability to that, they're going to have to get uncomfortable for us to deal with that racial predictability. And so if there's a cry to please don't disrupt my comfort with the status quo, it's a cry to keep things as they are. And that's not acceptable, not just for those who don't get to live as long. It should be unacceptable to all of us because it will reduce the humanity of all of us. If there's a parent who has one kid who's got major problems and another kid who doesn't, and they say, we're not going to pay attention to that kid who has all these major problems, that'll be really horrible for that kid who has major problems, but it's a horrible reflection of the character of the parent, that they would not provide that kind of attention where it's needed and look out for all of their children equally. And America has, throughout its history, looked at some of its children very differently and treated some of its children very differently. And that does not reflect well on the greatness of America. If we believe in its greatness, and I do, then we have to deliver on our self-stated values.
Mm-hmm. You allude to something, and Senator, you have too, that I think is really, sort of what is Congress's role in all of this. And I have been saying this for quite some time in having worked around policy. Tribal issues are always an afterthought in almost everything that Congress does. And I am struck by, how do we change that? Because in the areas that we work in, it's, for example, with the tribal home visiting program, it's a part of a larger program, but it's, oh, by the way, give them 3% of the total pot. So that means that we funded 25 tribes to get home visiting services when every state got money. So that's 26 out of 560 some tribes. Where is the balance here? Where is the sort of, how do we begin to tackle some of those inequities that start at the top and go all the way down? Mm-hmm. And I don't know if there's an answer to that, Senator, but you work there. So I don't
know there's a specific answer. I know that that it's too often an afterthought to be thinking about what are the consequences here with respect to Native Americans. I want to tell you about the afterthought issue a bit. So I was in the Senate when we worked on and passed the Affordable Care Act. President Obama proposed it. We passed it in the House and the United States Senate by one vote. A single vote. Now, I told them when we started this that I was going to be supportive of the Affordable Care Act, but I said the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act has to be a part of it because we have not reauthorized it for 15 years, and it was unbelievably that was the case. And as I said, it has to be a part of it. And the fact is, it wasn't added. The last thing that was added to the Affordable Care Act on the Senate side was the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act, because it passed by one vote. And I told the president, and I also told Senator Reid, you understand that I always meant what I said. If it's not there, I don't vote for it. That means it doesn't pass. You have to include it. And it was included at the last minute, as an afterthought, because I essentially threatened. But this happens virtually all the time. I think Dr. Treuer has said it properly. I don't think there is a public policy that represents the significant approach to dealing with these issues. But I do think that there needs to be a healthy national discussion about what exists And the only way to understand what exists is to really have the facts. I mean, just the one, for example, the twice as many Native Americans percentage that are homeless in Minnesota versus others. I mean, those kinds of things that, you know, when you think about it, you think, oh my God. So we need a national discussion, not just about what is, but we need a national discussion about what are our values in trying to find the solutions and reaching out to begin fixing what is broken. It is the case that the first Americans, especially first American children, are almost second in everything. Second class in almost everything: housing, health, education, and that just can't continue.
You know, and it's an enigma to me, because I hear people, talk about, and I think we come together around our children. Generally speaking, no one wants to see children hurt, but how does that translate into policies at even whether it's state or federal? We don't seem to make the translation from we all care about our children to, and here's how we do that. We put the resources behind it. We do better policies, etc. But it also gets to the issue in states, because again, states are a key player in all of this, and we are not getting where we need to. Some states right now are making terrific progress on this, but not all. And I think it's going to be a challenge for us over the next few years to see how we can build these relationships again with some of the state governments, between states and tribes. Again, back to that off the reservation, off the tribal lands piece. Both, I do want to take, I think we're getting close on this one, and I did want to see if we could get in a question or two from the audience. But one of the things that I wanted to talk to both of you about, both of you, also see hope, unless I am misunderstanding some of what I've read in your books. And I think the question is where do we go from here? How do we begin? I think Senator Dorgan, you've talked a little bit about this, but how do we begin to tackle this problem? I'm really interested in hearing concrete steps. What do we do next here? Where do we go? How can we help states get more engaged in this? What do we need to do?
Well, it's not a simple matter, but I do think that there are very specific things that we can do. One thing is there are lots of tribal leaders. They're really smart. They really care about their citizens on and off the reservation. They're well educated on the issues, and they have an array of policy concerns that we should seek to understand, ally ourselves to, and advance. Right now, things like there's legislation that's already been passed, in 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act, that is under active assault through litigation and policy initiative. And, the Indian Child Welfare Act is, a whole multi-hour discussion all by itself. So, I'll be brief, but it is legislation that is designed to support tribal sovereignty and to provide guidance when, for example, a Native child needs to be removed from his or her home for their safety, about doing it in a way that protects the sanctity of Indigenous families and the culture and community cohesion of that child to their community. So, that legislation is under assault is really concerning. The Violence Against Women Act seeks to remedy some of these jurisdictional issues so that we can protect Native women everywhere. And it's the kind of legislation that needs constant reauthorization by Congress. It gets tied up in political battles. And so you have an uneven, checkerboard quilt approach to keeping Native women safe that needs to be really strengthened and rendered much more permanent. A lot of people aren't aware, but of the more than 400 treaties signed with tribes, over 100 have health and education clauses, where the US federal government promises to provide for the health and education of Native people as long as grasses grow and rivers flow. Collectively, that's known as the federal trust responsibility. So even agencies like the Indian Health Service and the Bureau of Indian Education, those aren't special, rights for a special interest group. That's partial payment for the land sold. And while we could revisit the treaties, and tribes would probably be happy to do it because, we have lawyers now, at the same time, the US government has done a pretty poor job of delivering on its federal trust responsibility. So I think there are an array of policy initiatives around those kinds of legislation. I think there are all kinds of funding needs, whether it's line item things in broader funding, special funding to, stabilize and revitalize Indigenous cultures and languages. All of these things, really benefit from our attention. And states like, North Dakota, Minnesota, these are very purple states, and not just because of Prince. There are politically purple, Democrat, Republican, divided legislatures often, things like this. But there are ways to get things done. And, I think it's important that we build bridges across those kinds of aisles so that we can be effective in moving this sort of legislation, even though the cultural climate often makes that especially difficult.
Mhm. There's a really good question in the chat right now. So I'm going to take this one because I think it relates to what we're talking about. Somebody asked are there any existing partnerships that navigate the nuances of tribal sovereignty in states well that you know of?
That navigate the partnerships of tribes. I don't know the answer to that. I was going to, just as Dr. Treuer was talking, I was going to, at the end of my book, I put a list of some organizations that I have great respect for that are working and represent the origination of a lot of effort locally, tribally, and then also coming up through the states. National Indian Education Association, National Child Indian Welfare Association, the National Indian Health Board, United National Indian Tribal Youth, and one that I created, the Center for Native American Youth. These are organizations I think that can make a significant difference and have an interest of addressing the Native American issues. Let me just also comment on the Indian Child Welfare Act. There is an organization in Arizona, fairly well-funded, sizable, very conservative organization, is trying everything it can, has been working on it for a long while, of abolishing the Indian Child Welfare Act. And it's a serious problem, and one that needs to be responded to in an aggressive way. Dr. Treuer is right about that. But I think that, what we do need to do is understand, while it's not one policy or even a set of policies that will address these issues, adequate funding at the national level, at the congressional level, is critically important, whether it's Indian healthcare or Indian education. There are a fair number of kids that go to these Indian schools, and the fact is, the Native American schools, the fact is, as they've looked at the shape those schools are in, they're well below other schools. So there's a lot that can be done and should be done. Asking the Congress to begin meeting the promise it has made to Native American tribes, the promise of providing law enforcement, education, providing healthcare, and so on. And then I want to mention one other thing, if I might, the issue of the law. The fact is, there are lawyers out there representing tribes. There are tribal attorneys. There are people that have come through some terrific law schools, Native Americans working on these issues. And I want to mention to you one woman who is a hero of mine. She's gone now, but her name is Eloise Cobell. And the reason I mention Eloise Cobell is she took on the federal government and beat them for $3 billion. And at least it took her 15 years. And I love Eloise. I mean, what a remarkable, tough, strong woman from the Blackfoot tribe. And so part of that money is still going to Native American children in the form of scholarships, which is part of that money that was won in lawsuits. So you can also use the court system, as Dr. Treuer indicated. The court system can also be an area where you penetrate and make some progress. It's not very quick, but it can be certain in terms of the rights of the Native American citizens.
We have
Yeah.
another question. We have a couple more questions. Another one that I think relates to just what you were saying, Senator Dorgan, and it is that how can advocates help raise the voices and stories of Indigenous population that are currently unseen by policymakers? And I think you kind of answered that, but I do think that there's more that just the general advocacy population could do. And
Yeah, let me just say
Go
the
ahead.
6 most powerful words in any presentation is "let me tell you a story," by far. And that's why I have written this story. Let me tell you a story. It is what resounds and what I think persuades action and people to decide that they have responsibilities.
Mhm.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh,
No,
no,
that-
quite all right. I'd add, it is so critically important that we directly engage Native people and Native voices in all of this work. So often, like even when America came up with residential boarding schools as the solution to all of the problems in Indian country, people thought they were doing Natives a great favor and did tremendous harm and damage because they didn't even think through all the repercussions of their actions. And so we have to be not Native inspired, but Native led in these things. And that requires relationship building. They're in response to the question, like, are there things that are working? In the law enforcement world at, Red Lake and White Earth, for example, there are cooperative agreements with state agencies, county law enforcement agencies, the feds and tribes, on gang and drug intervention task forces. Some of them are doing really well. And then in the same state, sometimes you have great resistance to building cooperative relationships and making things happen, as we've seen down in Mille Lacs, for example. So that's something that human beings can either, do damage to or help advance, depending on their efforts around relationship building. And once we build in those areas, I think education, policy, and effort also, we see some significant improvement and efforts. But this is a very inequitable country. Across our country, we have some school districts that fund at less than $4,000 per pupil, and others that fund at over $40,000 per pupil, 10 times as much money. And even though we are more racially diverse than ever, something like 90% of the students of color go to schools that are 90% students of color. And those are the much more disproportionately poorly funded schools. And, as Senator Dorgan points out, scholarship support and so many other things break down. And I think about my mother, who went to school. Her whole K-12 experience, she only met one professional Native person ever. That was the school nurse. So she went on and became a nurse. And then she started working for the tribe's health program and thought, wow, Natives, they're being so mistreated. I'm going to do something about that. And went on to become Minnesota's first female Native attorney. And to me, there's no doubt about the power of an education as a lever to help people access opportunity, and to put us, into communication with one another and build bridges. It's the government has been busy colonizing and attacking and, trying to destroy tribal sovereignty for hundreds of years, and did it through multiple policy initiatives and cultural things. And so no one is going to fix it, but we need to tend to all of these solutions on the policy front, on the education front, on the funding front, on the culture, communication, and relationship building fronts too. All of those things will pay dividends.
We have one more question in here, and this is actually from a person who identifies as a state official. And it said, how do we as state officials start to open up the lines of communication with tribal leaders? And I think this is an important question because it ties in a little bit, Anton, to one of the things I think you said in your book about being, people are afraid sometimes that they're going to offend.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we have to figure out how to help people ask the questions and not be afraid to. And then, chances are they might get rebuked at some point, but let's start trying here.
Absolutely. I realize that in this day and age, not everybody's calling everybody in. Some people are interested in calling people out, and that can make it a little testy. When it comes down to it, though, men need to lean in on the gender front, even though it's not always comfortable, and there is a feeling of vulnerability to exposing an ignorance, offending someone, being misunderstood or accused of mansplaining or whatever. And white folk need to lean in on the racial front, even though there may be similar discomforts to what if I offend somebody? What if it comes out sideways? And we have so insulated one another from things like racial discomfort. Americans can travel the world and be accommodated in English in most of it, whether you're owning a house in Costa Rica or traveling Europe or whatever. And so, the musculature for experiencing just the basic discomfort of hearing a language other than English, it's not there for a lot of Americans, right? And it's the same with any kind of racial discomfort. But how are we going to address things if we don't face that discomfort and build it? Build some musculature. Don't let those muscles atrophy. For state officials, opening lines of communication, the tribal chair may not be responsive to every single request of every single magnitude, but they have governments, just like writing a letter to the President of the United States will not always get you a response. So depends on what the policy issue is. Usually there's a human resources director for every tribe. There's also a tribal historic preservation officer for every tribe. And, working with the folks who are in that particular lane may often be more effective. And then, some states like Minnesota has, Minnesota Indian Affairs, which is supposed to do liaison work between the tribes and the state government. And so working within those agencies and lanes can also improve and render just more efficient some of the communication. But if your first request, seems to fall on deaf ears, don't give up. It's important to be persistent, patient, and seek the right avenues for healthy communication.
In this case, if the question is from a state official or someone who is in the state government asking, how do we reach out? How do we connect? The answer is fairly simple. In my judgment, there are some really skilled and talented tribal leaders. There are some new leaders who come from the Champions for Change that we have created for over these years in the Center for Native American Youth. New young people who are part of the new leadership team. But there are tribal chairs and many others who are skilled, talented, and capable. And I would say to any state official, what you do is get in a car and go someplace and meet with tribal leaders, meet with the tribal council, and say to them, what can we do together? What kind of partnership can exist that will allow us to help you? You are citizens of our state as well. And we want to change things. So I went to a reservation on the border of North and South Dakota that's the size of the state of Connecticut. They had 12 police force, a 12-member police force. Think of it, 12 people, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in an area the size of Connecticut. If someone's being murdered, maybe they show up the next day, right? Maybe not. It's unbelievable. And the violent crimes of murder, for example, that has to be prosecuted by U.S. attorneys. In that particular tribal council, they told me, there's a U.S. attorney in one of our states that hasn't ever come here, never shown up. We don't know the person because apparently we're not on that person's radar, despite the fact that that person has a responsibility for law enforcement in our area. So there's a lot going on. I want to finish by just mentioning one thing to you. There are a lot of people who have been concerned for a long, long time about these issues. And the first chair of a committee in the United States Senate dealing with Indian issues that became the Indian Affairs Committee was Robert F. Kennedy. And Senator Robert F. Kennedy went out to some reservations and came back and said to the United States Senate, we need to respond to this. The gripping poverty, the unfairness, the racism. We need to respond to this, and that became the Indian Affairs Committee over time. And I was pleased and honored to have been able to chair that committee. But we need to do a lot more. I think I'm happy to be on with Anton Treuer and you, Linda. I think there's so much that is necessary to be done. And I would say this, everybody should understand, just as Anton has and I have, we need to tell the story. We've each tried to do that with a book, but telling the story is the most significant way to address these issues.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think to myself a lot coming from Montana, where I, am from, and having seen so many of the reservations, I think most of America just does not understand this issue. Sort of what has happened to, some of our citizens. It's really a disgrace. Well, I don't want to end on a completely negative note here. So I thought I would close out by, I thought, Anton, the last chapter of your book, or the closing to it, the conclusion, I guess, you told a little story in there about a little town and how things changed. And I think we do have to start there, but we have to have some hope. Would you share just quickly that little story about the language?
Oh, yeah. So among the hats I get to wear, I do a lot of work with teaching and revitalizing our Indigenous language, Ojibwe. And now we're to the point where we have a pretty good, coalition of people who are working on this. So we even have a bilingual signage effort where it's even on the cop cars. It says "Ganawangigeng Minawa Nadamageng" to protect and serve. That's in all the public spaces, the regional event center, and the public schools and things like that. These sorts of efforts don't eradicate all of the big problems, but what they do is they make some safe space where we can talk about those problems and where we can, see ourselves connected by some of those bigger transcendent values that I think all of us of all political persuasions are most likely to hold dear. And those sorts of things give me a lot of hope. I know that there's been a lot of unrest in our country and a lot of concern and fear about our political and cultural climate. But ultimately, I have great faith in our ability as human beings to build bridges and connections, to find meaningful solutions, to work cooperatively and collectively, and to make a real difference.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. So I thought that was such a nice story about just starting with a few things, like a few words that can help people bridge the sort of the divide that we have. I want to thank both of you so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation, and hopefully it's the beginning of something. I think we really have a lot of work to do, but like the two of you, I think we all have to be hopeful that we can get there and that we can change things if we collectively put our minds to it. So thank you again to both of you, and hopefully this is just the beginning of a conversation here. So with that, we will have the next part of this series in March, where we will bring in states that are trying to work on this with hiring people in places that can really make a difference within state government, and hiring Native Americans on staff to help bridge these gaps that are out there. So hopefully the second conversation will be as rich as this one. So thank you so much again, and best wishes to everybody. And I also want to, before I forget, I do want to reach out or thank Barb Faber, who helped us set this up and work behind the scenes on this, and Tammy, who works with her. Both of them were essential in putting this together. So thank you guys. So we will see you in a month. And thanks again, Senator Dorgan and Dr. Treuer.
Thank you, Linda.